Good morning, everybody. There's been quite a few babies being born on the farm in this last week. Some little kids, little kid goats, absolutely beautiful creatures, just beautiful. So it's a nice time to be here. It's a bit chilly today, but it's a nice time to be here. Now, we've just gone through maybe the hardest chapter in the book of Acts, heartbreaking in many ways. And when you read the book of Acts through, obviously Dr. Luke penned out the book of Acts, you have to appreciate the fact that Luke leaves in the good, the bad and the ugly. You know, he doesn't take anything out. You think about Ananias and Sapphira. You know, if you wanted to present the perfect religion, you wouldn't include that. You think about Paul and Barnabas and the terrible, dispute that they had together. They went their separate ways. If you wanted to project across to people the perfect religion, you wouldn't include that. And you certainly wouldn't include Acts 21. You certainly wouldn't put it in. But Luke shows us the church, warts and all. As Oliver Cromwell once said when he was having a painting done of himself because he had warts on his face, and they asked him, do you want us to kind of beautify your picture? And he said, no, I want you to paint me warts and all. And that is exactly what the book of Acts is. It shows the early church. It's the same with Paul's letters, Peter's letters, John's letters. It shows us the church, warts and all. And thank God that it does, because if it didn't, I think we would look at church today and we would struggle like mad. So we thank God that it is the case, that we see the church, warts and all. Now then, we need to have a look at quite a few scriptures in this, because this is such a challenging chapter and it requires us to dig deep. And the main framework of Acts 21, I named it A Band of Brothers to a Brood of Vipers, because it begins with Paul tearing himself away from the elders in Ephesus. Clearly they loved one another so much. They die for one another, there's no doubt about it. And he makes his way down to Jerusalem, and it just doesn't work out for Paul. And this is what we read in Acts chapter 21. Please, we need to read this again in the actual Zoom meeting. But Acts 21 verses 20 to 24, after Paul had explained the glorious things that had happened in the missionary journeys, this is what it says. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children nor walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them. Pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law." So we get this, it's shocking really to hear. And the more you think about it, the more shocking it becomes. Now, what I would like us to do in the Zoom meetings, and I know this is a long read, but it's a vital read, is to read the entire chapter of Matthew 23 and the first 2 verses of Matthew 24. And the reason being that this is really the Lord's conclusion of the Pharisees, of the leaders. It's his conclusion. He walks away from the temple and he says, "You shall not see me again until I hear you say, 'Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord.'" And the disciples look to the temple and say, "Lord, how can you forsake this?" It was incredible. And Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left upon another." Now, the reason why it's important that we read that is because we need to understand, it's so important to understand, that the early church, particularly the Jewish church in Jerusalem, was in transition. From the day that the curtain was torn from top to bottom, when Christ cried out, "It is finished," there was a 40-year period where the temple still stood. So the church was in transition. And I believe as you look in the book of Acts, there was a certain amount of grace upon the Jewish believers while this temple still stood. And they were having to figure out, how does this all play out? It was very difficult for them to figure out. They were in transition. However, of course, around about 66 AD, the book of Hebrews was written, which was really the last warning to the Jewish people. And the book of Hebrews basically tells us that Christ is the fulfillment of every single sacrifice in the Old Testament. It's very, very clear. It was written by a Jew to the Jews. Around about 4 years later, the temple was destroyed. Now, you would think that with the temple being destroyed, and there was literally no way of keeping the law anymore. You can't keep the law without a sacrificial system. It's impossible. You would think then at that point that the Jews would finally come to their senses and embrace Jesus as their Messiah. After all, Daniel chapter 9 tells us that the Messiah would be cut off before the temple was destroyed. It was all there. But instead of doing that, there was a rabbi called Yohanan ben Zakkai that basically made up another form of Judaism, which didn't need a temple. So instead of turning to Christ, Jesus, they kind of just made up another religion. And yet, in all this, God has not abandoned his people. How amazing is that? So, what I would like us to do is look together at some scriptures. I want us to look at really, and we've looked at this before, but in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, we need to read this together. It's so important. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. Right the way through to verse 14. I want you to read that together. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. And this is the first question. Bearing in mind that we've just read Matthew chapter 23 and Luke 18, verse 9, right the way through to verse 14, 9 to 14. Here's the first question. In what ways are we like the Pharisees? In what ways are we like the Pharisees? Okay, now let's move on. Please turn to Matthew 22, verses 36 to 40. Matthew 22, verses 36 to 40. Now, I know we've looked at this before. We will have to continue to look to this until we get it. Matthew 22, verses 36 to 40. What does it teach us? It teaches us that we are not just to love God, but that we are to love one another. And although we have looked at this time and time and time again, I believe that this is one of the most important teachings for the church today. you have people that to some degree love one another, but have no real love for the word or for the God of the word. But they do good deeds to one another. Maybe they set up food banks, they do this, they do that, they do the other. But there's really not much emphasis on the word or a real genuine love for the God of the word. On the other hand, I see many people that have a love for the word and the God of the word, but somehow just don't seem to know how to love one another. And it's as though it doesn't matter. And this is vital to the last days, because it tells us in Matthew chapter 24. It begins by saying, do not be deceived. 4 times it says that. But one of the big evidences of the last days is that the love of the many will have waxed cold. So this love for God and for one another is absolutely essential. You can't drop one. You can't choose. You can't choose to say, well, I uphold the love for God, but for me, I don't need to walk with my brothers. They're not worthy of me. Or I can't do with God's standards, but I'll walk with people. It's not one or the other. We don't get to choose which one. It is both. I've explained this many times. Jesus didn't just come with truth. He came full of grace and truth. And one without the other, truth on its own is a blunt instrument. Jesus didn't just come with truth. He wasn't like the Pharisees that said, I'm glad I'm not like the others. He ate with the tax collectors. He ate with the prostitutes. He walked with people because he knows what we're like. Jesus warned the Pharisees more about hell than he did about sinners. That's the truth. Now then, after we've read this, we need to understand that just as the church in the book of Acts, particularly the Jewish church in Jerusalem, was in transition, the temple still stood, but they were having to figure out that Christ was the fulfillment of the whole sacrificial system, yet the temple still stood. So we, all of us, are also in transition. We're being changed from glory to glory. We call it sanctification. We're going through this walk and God is dealing with us on a daily basis. While we're in this temple, in this body, you know, in Romans chapter 7, Paul says, the wretched man am I, who will deliver me from this body of death? We are in transition. And until this temple, until this body actually dies, we're going to be in transition. And we are walking through this life trying to work things out. And it's not easy. Christianity is not easy. Why is it so narrow? What makes it so narrow? Because we've got to keep all these laws? No, that's not what makes this walk so hard. What makes this walk so hard is not only have we got to uphold the word, we have to love one another. That's what makes it so hard. That's what makes it so challenging. John chapter 13 verses 34 to 35. John 13 verses 34 to 35. Many people talk about their love for the word, their love to keep the word. And of course that is exactly what Jesus wants us to do. But in John chapter 13 verses 34 to 35, he commands his disciples. Remember, we've already seen what is the greatest law. Love is the greatest law. Love is the greatest law. He commands his disciples to love one another as he has loved them. That's a command. That command is essential to the church. It's a command. And we see people falling out over so many different things. But they want to brush under the carpet the command that Jesus gave to them at Passover, just before he gave his life for them. He says, this is the new command, but he says it's not new. I want you to love one another. I command you to love one another the way that I have loved you. Now, I would like us to read 1 Corinthians 13. And I want you to read it out aloud. But what I want you to do is exchange the word love for your own name. And for those of you that can, I want you to read out, whenever you see that word love, put your own name there. And continue through it. Let me show you what I mean. Let me turn to 1 Corinthians. And those of you that know me will know that this is not a description of Tim Leach. Okay? Let me read it out to you. Tim is patient. Tim is kind. Tim does not envy. Tim does not parade himself. Tim is not puffed up. Tim does not behave rudely. Tim does not seek his own. Tim is not provoked. Tim thinks no evil. Tim does not rejoice in iniquity. Tim rejoices in the truth. Tim bears all things. Tim believes all things. Tim hopes all things. Tim endures all things. Tim never fails. Now, this might seem like a strange thing to do, but in your groups, those of you that will, I want you to read that out aloud and put your own name there. Put your own name there. Because these are the two greatest commands. Above all other commands, these are the two greatest. That we love our Lord. And of course, by loving him, we must obey his word, okay? But not only do we love our Lord, we love one another as Christ loved us. So you don't drop one for the other. You uphold both. Let me continue. We know in Revelation, I think we looked at it last week. In Revelation chapter 2, the church of Ephesus, we saw how Paul warned them that wolves were coming and that they were to be on the guard. We read in Revelation chapter 2 that they had done that. 40 years had gone by before Jesus wrote the next letter. We know that they had kept their guard and they had tested those that say they are apostles and are not. They found them to be liars. But somewhere along the line, they had departed from their first love. And this is a burden that the Lord has put upon me, and it's very strong. And that burden is this, that unless we get back to the communication of the gospel, not just to the unsaved, but to the church itself, we will never move forwards. We need to understand what love is. We need to understand what Christ has done and how Christ loves us. We cannot, for the sake of truth, leave our first love. We must uphold both at the same time. I've already said in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus warned them deception's coming. Of course it's coming. It's all around us at the moment. But he warns them the love of the many will wax cold. Now look at the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had 4 different wives. Even though from the very beginning, the commandment was always one husband, one wife. It's never changed. That's what it was. Jacob had 4 wives. You look at the 12 tribes of Israel and what an absolute calamitous mess they were. What a catastrophic disaster they were in themselves. How many times they failed God. Again and again and again. You take the gospel out of the Bible. You take the love of God out of the Bible, you've got nothing. God, I believe, tested Moses. When they were committing the sin of the golden calf, he says, I'll wipe them out and start again, Moses, with you. And Moses interceded with the Lord and said, Lord, you can't do that. Now, God was never going to do that. but he wanted to see Moses' heart. He wants to see our heart. He wants to see whether we actually love one another or whether we can just write one another off. The 12 tribes of Israel were a disaster. Sin upon sin upon sin. You look at David, and a man after God's own heart. You look at the whole string of sins that David committed. And yet the Bible tells us, we know where David is. You look at Abraham. Abraham even lied at times, and yet we see him in paradise. Friends, why is this? How can this be? I'll tell you how. Because God never gave up on the 12 tribes of Israel. The high priest has to wear them over his heart when he goes into the Holy of Holies. All those precious jewels that represent one of the tribes of Israel. He wears them over his heart. At the end of all this, in Jeremiah, of all books in Jeremiah, God said to Jeremiah, tell them, I have loved you with an everlasting love. He never, ever gives up on us. Then we get to the church. And we see that from almost the outset, things began to go wrong. You look at the Corinthian church. What an absolute mess the Corinthian church was. How many different sins. Did Paul walk away from them? No. Did God walk away from them? No. You look at Galatians and this legalism that had seeped in. Of course, Paul warns them. Of course he warns the Corinthians. But does he stop loving them and walking with them? No. Did God walk away from them? No. You look at the Ephesian church, and how at the end of it, he tells them, you've got to get back to your first love. You look at the Colossian church. You look at the letter that was written to the Jews, Hebrews, warning them, loving them. Even after Yohanan ben Zakkai made up a completely different religion, after the temple had gone, God has not given up on the church. You look at Pergamon with its sexual immorality, Thyatira with its sexual immorality, Sardis with this outward show of power, Laodicea with its lukewarmness. God says to Laodicea, to those I love, I rebuke. But does he walk away from us? No, he doesn't. Did he walk away from the 12 tribes? No, he didn't. Did he walk away from the church? No. Friends, we are in transition. And until this body is gone, we will never be fully free from all sin. None of us. We should hopefully be being changed from glory to glory. We should hopefully be becoming better people, more gracious, more compassionate, upholding the truth more, living it out more. But are we ever going to be free from sin? No, we're not. Not until this temple is destroyed. Not until we get up there and he gives us a new temple, a new body. We're not. My final question to you is this. In the light of all this, what makes Jesus so different than us? What makes Jesus so different than us? Have a wonderful Zoom meeting.